Welcome back to our six-part series on the Second Vatican Council from a salvation historical view. In the last lesson, we talked about the Church and her role in salvation history, and talking about the fact that she is necessary, that she was established by Christ as the means of salvation, and that all are called to be members of her. In this lesson, we're going to hone in on two important aspects of life in the Church, which are doctrine or teaching, and sacraments, which correspond to truth and grace. And so to start, I'd like to talk about different levels of church teaching, because this often gets confusing for people. And so I want to talk about the types of church teaching, or the levels of teaching, the assent owed to each level of teaching, and then the different modes or ways that those teachings can be given. So, first of all, the highest level is called dogma. So this would be the highest level of teaching, or dogmas of the faith. And dogmas are those truths that are defined as being directly revealed by God, and therefore they are owed what is called the assent of faith. So that's the assent owed, and you might remember that from Dei Verbum, when we're talking about the fact that what is owed to revelation is the obedience of faith. Well, that's the same thing here, that dogmas are owed faith, because it is the acceptance of what God has revealed because God has revealed it. And so that's why they belong on that level. So dogmas are infallible teachings that have been revealed by God. And the Church will define certain dogmas, meaning that the magisterium is affirming positively that, yes, this is a truth of revelation that we know because God has revealed it, and therefore we must believe it. So faith, little note about language here. English, because it's such a mix of many different language families, sometimes loses some connections between words. So, for instance, faith and belief in English are related, but they're different roots, right? You can't see the connection between them. In some other languages, the connection is more clear. So, for instance, in Latin, credere is to believe. This is why we have the creed, right? So the faith, the word for faith and the word for to believe would actually have the same root, and so you would see the connection. And the same is true in German and other languages as well. So just try to keep that in mind, because the word belief is going to come up a lot. And the word belief in this context doesn't just mean, oh yeah, I think that's the case in some way, or I choose to think that that's the case. What we mean in a theological sense is to believe is to assent with faith, which is a theological virtue. So we don't mean this in a generic sense. We mean this in a very specific technical theological sense as giving the assent of faith. Okay, so whenever you hear that in these documents, it's talking about faith here. All right, so what are ways that dogmas can be taught? The first is an explicit definition given by an ecumenical council. So a definition by an ecumenical council. These were often given in the early church as responses to different heresies that arose. So, for instance, the First Council of Nicaea was called primarily to deal with the Arian heresy. And the Arian heresy basically was stating that this priest Arius was trying to say that, well, yes, Jesus is the incarnate Word, but the Word that was made incarnate was not God, but just simply like God, and was created by God as an instrument through which he created everything else. And he also didn't have a human soul, so that the Word took the place of the human soul in Christ. And so there were multiple errors involved in Arianism. Denied his full divinity and denied his full humanity. And so this was seen by the church as it was actually a very widespread heresy, meaning a lot of people bought into it. And so the Council of Nicaea gathered the bishops together to deal with this, and it condemned Arianism and defined the faith, the dogma that no, we know from Revelation, from our scripture, and from tradition that Jesus is fully God and fully man. And there were other councils that dealt with this same issue as well, because controversies continued, like we've said, after other councils as well. So Ephesus and Chalcedon also had to weigh in on it. And so ecumenical councils can define dogmas of the faith, and therefore it's binding, meaning all must believe this with faith. Okay, so there's another mode where the church can issue an infallible teaching of dogma requiring faith, and that's through the definitions of a pope. Okay, this is often referred to as ex cathedra teaching, which is Latin for from the chair. And what it's referring to is the authority of St. Peter, from the chair of St. Peter as being the head of the whole church. The Pope can, in fact, issue dogmatic definitions as the head of the whole church. All right, so let's learn about these two forms from the council itself. Lumen Gentium states, with regards to the first one, that it's talking about when bishops are gathered together in an ecumenical council, they are teachers and judges of faith and morals for the universal church, whose definitions must be adhered to with the submission of faith. And then it goes on to refer to this as an exercise of infallibility. All right, and then it goes on to talk about the Pope. And this is the infallibility which the Roman pontiff, the head of the College of Bishops, enjoys in virtue of his office, when, as the supreme shepherd and teacher of all the faithful, who confirms his brethren in their faith, by a definitive act, he proclaims a doctrine of faith or morals. And therefore, his definitions of themselves, and not from the consent of the church, are justly styled irreformable, since they are pronounced with the assistance of the Holy Spirit, promised to him in blessed Peter, and therefore they need no approval of others, nor do they allow any appeal to any other judgment. And this is essentially just reiterating the dogmatic definition by an ecumenical council that the Pope also can teach infallibly. Remember, this was dogmatically defined by Vatican I. Now, keep in mind that when the Church defines a dogma, that doesn't mean that it all of a sudden now becomes true and wasn't the case before, or that it wasn't believed in the past. It just means that in a given day and age, the Church is defining something to clarify a teaching that might be, come under question, or there's some reason that highlighting this truth as a matter of faith is important for that particular day and age. So it doesn't mean that it's new, it just means that it's now being explicitly taught in this mode, okay? So keep in mind, though, that this ability of the Pope to dogmatically define things was also a dogma issued by an ecumenical council. So if you hold to the ecumenical councils being able to do this and they dogmatically define something, then you also have to accept this one, since the council is what defined this one. So the two go hand in hand in that sense. Okay, now there's another mode by which the church can teach infallible dogmas. Okay, and that is through what's called it's got two components, so keep that in mind. It's ordinary and universal magisterium. So it's ordinary and universal. So it's both together. Why do we say that? Because these two are known as extraordinary magisterial teachings, okay? Because they're outside of the ordinary. They're not typically done. They are particularly solemn ways of teaching. Ecumenical councils and dogmatic definitions of popes are not as common. This level is different. It's ordinary and universal. What does that mean? So the council basically defines ordinary and universal magisterium as referring to when the bishops remaining in their own places, meaning they're not gathering together in an ecumenical council, nevertheless, in unity with the Pope, all are in agreement that a certain doctrine is infallible. So it might not have been priorly defined by an ecumenical council or by a pope, but the bishops are basically in agreement that, yes, this is a matter of the faith. This is something that has been revealed, even though we didn't come together and define it. Yes, I believe this truth is a matter of divine revelation. And the bishops are unanimous about that, in union with the Pope. Then that's considered to be infallible by the ordinary and universal. Ordinary because it's each bishop holding that and teaching that, and it's universal because it's throughout the world. Okay? So, the assent of faith is owed to those dogmas issued in any of those different ways. Now, it is important to note that individual bishops do not have the prerogative of infallibility, which Lumen Gentium says in number 25. So the local bishop of your diocese, unless you happen to live in Rome, cannot issue infallible statements on his own. He can reiterate infallible teachings and therefore participate in that way, but an individual bishop is not considered to teach infallibly, because infallible basically means it's irreformable because it is free from error. And that's what infallible means. Infallible means that this particular teaching, the way that it is expressed, is free from error. That's what it means. And therefore, it must be believed if it's a dogma. All right, so there's also, I want to go on here. All right. Oh, yes, sorry. The next level of teaching, this might get a little bit confusing. Infallible doctrines. Wait a minute, Dr. DeClue, didn't you say that dogmas were infallible doctrines? So what's the difference here? The difference is the assent owed to them, okay? So an infallible doctrine is also true, and therefore it's free from error. But it's not owed the assent of faith. Rather, what we say is that it must be definitively held. So there is a slight distinction between these two. Definitively held. In Latin, we say that this is credenda, must be believed, coming from the word creed for faith. And this is tenenda, which means to be held. Okay, so there's a difference. Well, what is the difference? The difference is that these doctrines are related to what God has revealed, meaning there's some logical connection. Let's say that if you denied this doctrine, you would logically be denying a dogma of the faith. Therefore, we know this must be true. And the church has definitively taught that this is true, but it might not necessarily have been directly revealed by God. That's why it's owed a different type of assent. So in both cases, they are true, and you must hold them to be true, but only God is owed the assent of faith. So what God has revealed, because faith is the assent to what God has directly revealed. So even though we know that these doctrines are true, it's not the assent of faith, even though we must definitively hold it as true. It's because it's not directly revealed by God. So I know that might seem confusing, but that's the difference between these two levels, meaning they're both infallible, but this is owed the assent of faith, and that's to be definitively held. Now, it is possible that the language of the church may at one point refer to a specific doctrine as being definitively held, and then it could later say, well, it needs to be believed and be elevated to the level of dogma, officially speaking. So that is a possibility. All right, so what are the ways that infallible doctrines can be taught? Well, that's easy. It's the same ways as the dogmas. And again, the difference is simply whether it's proclaimed to be definitively held or to be believed with the assent of faith. That's the difference. Let me give you an example of that. The reservation of priestly ordination to men alone is usually the number one example given by theologians to express this, because it was dealt with by Pope John Paul II in Ordinatio Sacerdotalis. Now, there's some debate about whether or not his statement is an act of papal infallibility or not. There are some indications that because he did use the term, it must be definitively held. But in either case, you see the explanation being given that that doctrine is to be definitively held because it's already been held through the ordinary universal magisterium. So that doctrine, according to JP2 and I believe it was Ratzinger while he was at the CDF, was saying that the Pope in that document was restating something that was already infallible by virtue of the ordinary and universal magisterium. So it's a good example for both of these categories, ordinary and universal, as well as something that needs to be definitively held. Okay, so there's the third level, which is ordinary teaching. Teachings of the ordinary magisterium. And this is probably the most common level of teaching that you're going to find. A lot of encyclicals would be ordinary magisterial teachings, so they're authoritative, but they're not containing some dogmatic definition. But does that mean that we can just pass over them and not take them seriously? Absolutely not. So the council is very clear on this. They are owed the assent of religious submission. There's a couple of different ways this is expressed, but it's religious submission of intellect and will. So again, those are the two parts of the soul, right? The intellect and the will are what make us the image of God. And so we assent with our intellects and wills, so with our mind and with our free choice, to those teachings. And the Latin is obsequium. So it's a submission, it's an obedience, if you will. So you'll see a couple of different translations or a couple of different ways of talking about this. But it's a religious assent or religious submission of mind and will to that teaching. And Vatican II speaks about it here. It says, bishops teaching in communion with the Roman pontiff are to be respected by all as witnesses to divine and Catholic truth. In matters of faith and morals, the bishops speak in the name of Christ, and the faithful are to accept their teaching and to adhere to it with religious assent. So here it's talking about when bishops teach the faith and morals, that the faithful are called to give this religious submission of intellect and will. You might call it a deference. It's sort of giving them the presumption that they are teaching the truth. It's not necessarily been infallibly defined, but it's sort of a trust that, yes, they are teaching truthfully. Now, this must also be given to the Pope, and the document's very clear about this. It says, this religious submission of mind and will must be shown in a special way to the authentic magisterium of the Roman pontiff, even when he is not speaking ex cathedra. That is, it must be shown in such a way that his supreme magisterium is acknowledged with reverence, the judgments made by him are sincerely adhered to according to his manifest mind and will. So again, it's this religious submission. So even if he's not giving an infallible definition on either of these two levels, if the Pope is giving some teaching on faith or morals, you still have to take it seriously. And it's part of the ordinary magisterium. In this case, it would be the ordinary papal magisterium. So the bishops and the Pope both can do this. So it also makes sense that ecumenical councils can do this as well. So sometimes ecumenical councils will teach things without issuing an anathema that negates a heresy, or without defining some dogma as being either a dogma needing to be believed or doctrine needing to be held. But you still need to take those seriously and just sort of presume that they are true. So it's not an assent to faith, it's not definitively held, but you're just submitting to the teaching of authority of the church, recognizing that this teaching office was given to the church by Christ and therefore is to be assented to. So what does that mean? Unfortunately, there's been some Catholics who have been saying things like, well, Vatican II isn't infallible, so I really don't have to take it seriously. Whatever, don't need to assent to it. Well, that's not true, because it most clearly falls under, at minimum, ordinary magisterium from the highest form of magisterial teaching, meaning an ecumenical council is like the most extraordinary way of teaching anything. And so even if it's teaching something on the ordinary level, it still needs to be taken very seriously. So that's something that we must always keep in mind. And that's why we also need to recognize that it is a form of assent. You see, if we only assent when we happen to agree, or the Pope or the council say something that I already thought beforehand, then we're really only obeying ourselves. And that's not obedience. That's not assent. That's just pride and arrogance. And so that's why we need to assent to it. But there should be a joy in that as well, a willingness to assent, a willingness to assume that the church established by Christ is more likely to be right than I am, if there's some conflict between the two. It's that deference, again, that we give. And so Catholics are not free to just go around lambasting ecumenical councils, including Vatican II, or publicly proclaiming that they think that a council is in error. That's not something that we are just free to do as Catholics. As Pope St. Paul VI said about Vatican II, the council has invested its teaching with the authority of the supreme ordinary magisterium, which ordinary magisterium is so obviously authentic, meaning authoritative, that it must be accepted with docility and sincerity by all the faithful.